been asked as I've been out hawking this book how on earth I had stumbled into this terrain. But the honest answer is that it's fairly obvious for someone like me. I mean, obviously the degree of coincidence here is unusual, but it's fairly obvious if you're looking at the fundamentals of a relationship to see what the basic tensions are. I mean, you didn't have to have the Raymond Davis case to know that the CIA, depending on but not trusting the ISI in Pakistan as it pursued Al-Qaeda, our greatest national adversary for the moment, would seek to have its own independent sources of information, and that it would run what we would call unilateral operations, sometimes with undeclared personnel, in an effort to get the very best information it could so as to evaluate the information it was getting through its normal liaison relationship with its Pakistani partner. In my mind, that's just in the nature of things, and that certainly was the case when I was thinking about the plot of the book several years ago. Similarly, as I think about this part of the world and think about how we're going to get out of the situation in which we've gotten ourselves so deeply, both in Pakistan and in Afghanistan, I do think there's great wisdom in the cultural rituals for resolving disputes that I've summarized with the term blood money. But if you read the book, or more to the point, if you know something about the Pashtun culture, the Pashtunwali, you'll know that this is a part of the world where people are very good at starting wars and get into them all the time, but partly as a consequence of that, they're also pretty good at ending them, or at least finding ways to balance equities between combatants. And I think that there's a very powerful lesson for us there. I've said this to American officials when I go to interview them, and I will say this to this audience. As we think about a process over the next several years that will lead to the withdrawal of our troops from Afghanistan and hopefully to a more stable relationship with Pakistan, I think it's important to understand that in the culture of that part of the world, you don't resolve a dispute without preserving, sometimes reinforcing the other party's sense of dignity. That balance of worth and value and dignity is part of what makes resolving a dispute possible. If one side is humiliated, we tend to think, in my judgment, that it will be easier to resolve the dispute because you've overwhelmed the other side. But in truth, the more we look at conflicts in this broad part of the world, the more we can see that that just isn't so. That paradoxically, from our standpoint, the weaker people are in terms of all the physical attributes, the more determinedly they hold on to their dignity, the more they refuse to capitulate in the way that we want and expect. So I do think that as we think about a process of negotiation, extrication, which I think is essential for our country, that we ought to bear in mind the fundamental traditions and rituals of this culture, because if we don't bear them in mind, if we try to overwhelm them, sometimes when I read the news about night raids and how many mid-level Taliban we've taken out and how many predator attacks we've staged, on the tactical level, I think that's a show of our strength, and there are many advantages. But I think on the strategic level of extricating ourselves, we do have to bear in mind that there's a cost. That the idea that you can pound your adversary into the ground and then he'll put up a white flag and say, "That's it, sorry Charlie, never should have done it in the first place," it just doesn't happen that way. And this book is a thriller, not a treatise in political science, but it does try to explore those issues in the lives of the characters. So let me just say a few words about how I came to write this book. I actually set out to write an entirely different novel. This, I hope, will give you some insight into what a strange business writing fiction is. It was 2008, the markets were crashing, all anybody was thinking about was money and how it was managed and mismanaged. And I got fascinated with the issue of how the CIA might, in the world that we're living in now, finance its operations, or how people who were operating outside of the cone of legality might do that. I had a friend who still runs one of the big hedge funds in London, and I said, "Can I come camp out at your hedge fund, kind of live in Mayfair, and look over your shoulder at how your operations work? Because I think I'd like to write a novel." I even had a title for it. I was going to call it Mayfair, which, as I said the other night, sounds like Thackeray or George Eliot. Mayfair, lords and ladies going around St. James. But it was a book. I was so serious about it. I wrote a 15,000 word outline for my publisher. I mean, that's for some writers, that's almost to a novel at 15,000 words. So I had a lot invested in it. In 2009 decided to get some work done. I'd already spent my time researching at this hedge fund, and I thought to really get writing, I would escape Washington and I would go back to Paris, where I used to live. And the apartment I used to have, which is just unspeakably wonderful, when I invited the former French Foreign Minister Dominique de Villepin to my apartment, which was literally next to the Eiffel Tower, he said, "Mon cher David, that this is forbidden. C'est défendu. You have privatized the Eiffel Tower. You've turned it into your lawn ornament." But it's a magnificent apartment. It has a balcony that wraps around the entire apartment. It's on the Quai Branly next to the Eiffel Tower. So anyway, it was taken over when I left by a prosperous friend of mine who knew that having some Paris real estate was a good idea. And so he let me camp out there, and I just hid away in September of 2009 for weeks. The Washington Post couldn't find me, and I worked on this novel. I was on my way to Pakistan, where I had been visiting with greater and greater frequency, and so I thought, well, I'll work on my hedge fund novel. And then I went off to Pakistan, and on this trip I ended up visiting Wana in South Waziristan. I went to Peshawar. I sort of bumped around the tribal areas with, inevitably, escorts from the Inter Services Intelligence. You just don't get to South Waziristan without a minder from the ISI. And I also had a chance to talk to their top officials. If I describe what their headquarters looks like in the Atbara neighborhood, it's because I've been there. And if I describe what the Director General's office looks like, sort of, I was taking some liberties. Again, it's because I've been there. And that's part of the fun of researching these books. Anyway, I got back from this trip, and I kept trying to get to work on this hedge fund novel. And I'm sure it won't surprise you that I really couldn't, and that something had just taken over not only my conscious interests as a journalist, but my preconscious, subconscious interests as a writer. And it just was crowding out the other. It was insisting on entering into the story that I'd written. So all of a sudden, new characters began appearing, and the shape of the book changed. A lot of the hedge fund stuff actually stayed in, but as a secondary plot, and it really became the book that I have been describing to you.